I'm really glad to be speaking at the conference again. I spoke at the Agile Tour in 2018 and actually spoke on a very related topic, which is a lot of fun. So in 2018, my friend Christian Hasse and I started writing a new book about impact mapping. And we wanted to write a book about how do people actually get this wonderfully right. How do we help people who are starting with impact mapping to get the most out of it? So the talk I did in 2018 was actually at the start of this journey when I was giving you some kind of early research materials, and we've collected a lot more data in the past 2 years. The book is still not out, unfortunately, because that takes a bit of time. But what I'll do today is I'll give you an update on what we've concluded. We've been able to clarify some ideas quite significantly, and I've nailed down kind of the advice I want to present today to 5 important things that people should remember when they're doing impact mapping sessions. Hopefully this helps you facilitate and get more out of the whole thing. So the slides are already online on the PDF, and you can download them from my website. You can see the URL there. And I'm not going to spend too long introducing myself. I'm Gojko, and I'm a kind of developer and a consultant. I've wrote a couple of books like Impact Mapping and Specification, by example, running serverless. Last couple of years, I've mostly been building my products. And the latest product I'm working on is a tool that helps teams and developers create videos very easily with converting stuff like Markdown and PowerPoints into videos where you can create documentation, put it inside your version control, and build videos automatically to always have video explainers and documentation and tutorials in sync with your apps. So kind of that's what I'm doing now. If that's interesting to anybody, check out Narakeet.com, but that's not really the topic of today's presentation. So the stuff I want to talk about today is how do we get the most value out of delivering software? Because that's what impact mapping is about. How do we get the most out of our efforts? And when we talk about that, we have to talk about business goals and objectives. And people talk about objectives and key results now. That seems to be popular and all kind of stuff like that. And it's important to differentiate 2 types of objectives that people usually have in software projects. And these 2 types of objectives work on different timing schedules. We have some objectives that are only achievable in months or in years after we deliver software. And we have some objectives that theoretically are achievable in a week or in 2 days. Now, the ones on this side are the ones that the business and the customers really want. And that's the one type that relatively everybody can agree on easily, and people can talk about this stuff and create some lofty expectations about that. And these things tend to be stuff around revenue or market share or risk. And those kind of things are very easy to talk about because you can get stakeholders to sit down and agree like, oh, the purpose of this product over the next 2 years is to have 5 million customers. Or what we're going to do for the next 6 months is we are going to launch in a new country that will increase our market share, or we are going to make the company more profitable and things like that. So these types of goals are relatively easy to discuss. They're relatively easy to talk about. Everybody can agree on them. This is what on the top level will drive objectives and key results. The big problem with stuff like that is that a single Jira ticket is not going to make a big difference for any of this stuff. A single user story, even 20 user stories, very unlikely to massively increase market share. And even if they do, these things will tend to happen on a much longer much delayed cycle, which means that I do some stories now. People maybe start buying, then they buy, and we double the revenue. But that's not going to happen overnight. If you want to increase your user base by 5 million in 6 months, it's very unlikely that it's going to be for 4 months and 30 days, no effect, and then the last day, 5 million people come. So one of the things that we need to be able to answer, one of the things that we need to know is, are we even going in the right direction? And this is where this other type of objectives comes in. Objectives that we can achieve next week. Objectives that we can achieve tomorrow after I release a user story. And the big problem with these types of objectives is almost nobody knows how to manage them. Because it's very unlikely that, I tweak a feature here that creates a big result. And business people kind of don't care about small results. So here we have kind of this problem of two different types of objectives and stuff that is not easy to manage. And this research we started doing about impact mapping, we've now interviewed about 200 organizations. We've heard some really amazing stories of how people succeeded kind of balancing out these two types of value. One story we heard that's really inspirational for me is from a government organization in the US. We're still working on all the kind of approvals to publish everything, so I can't name any names yet. Hopefully everything will be in the book. And they had this huge initiative that was going to take a few years to implement. And after spending about a year and a half, they only had requirements for this change. And the requirements were massive. It was going to be too long. They were never going to reach the timeline. There was new legislation introduced, so there was a hard deadline. The law is already passed. There's a date when the law is going to take effect. And the whole change they were doing was to meet that legislation. Now, this is a really good example of that massive value, where it's going to take years and years of work to meet that legislation. But there's too much work to do. And if we just start and try to implement small bits and pieces, that will never be done in time. So the people who we interviewed there took a slightly different approach. They started thinking about, how would we know that we're going in the right direction? How would we know that we are measuring some kind of outcome there, that we're not really measuring if we are shipping a solution, that we're measuring that we're actually solving a problem? And they identified that in order for them to meet this legislation at the end, human caseworker processing these cases will need to be able to do many more cases per day. This legislation is going to introduce a lot more demand, and they will not be able to hire a lot more people. So everything they do in software should be able basically to enable them to process more cases per day. Now, when we have something like that, we have an objective. We have some value that we can actually go and measure shorter term. I can deliver 3 user stories, and I can see if human caseworkers can process more cases per day or not. I can adjust my plan based on these things. I can start delivering a piece that I think is really good and focus it on enabling people to deliver more, to process more cases per day. If they're not, then what I'm doing is wasteful. I should go and change my plan. I should go and adjust what I'm doing. So I think kind of the overall thing was do 75 cases per day per person. And every time they released a piece of software, they were measuring how the numbers are changing. They were reporting that number to everybody. And that was allowing people to decentralize decision-making and make better kind of, or have better opinions about what's worth doing, what's not worth doing. They were able to present this number to business stakeholders, and business stakeholders would say basically, yeah, continue doing it, don't continue doing it. And this allowed them to reach what they called full operation capacity, which is the US government way of saying the product is live and it's been accepted 2 years before anybody expected. So from a perspective of something that was a year and a half kind of late to something that was 2 years before anybody expected, this is totally amazing. And I think one of the key things that enabled them to do that is they were able to kind of find this way of figuring out if they're going the right direction and then drive towards that very clearly. And they actually used impact maps for this. That's how we found them. So this is a wonderful result that we should all be able to repeat, but lots of organizations struggle doing things like that. There was a famous case of a 75 million project at the British Broadcasting Corporation, the British TV, where they spent 75 million pounds over a few years doing personalization items for the video player to make the video player more personalizable for users. And after spending 75 million pounds, they killed it because it delivered no value. Now, first of all, that's totally insane. How can you spend so much money without delivering any value? And because this is funded from public subscriptions, the British government's National Audit Office got involved to understand how is it even possible to spend so much money without delivering value, and why did you not notice this sooner? Again, this problem of are we going the right direction? And the conclusion is absolutely amazing. You'll find it in this URL when you download the slides. The conclusion is that they could spend so much money because it was agile. And what that meant was that the managers could make up the benefits as they went along. Every month, whatever was delivered, they declared to be valuable. Because they had this disconnect between some longer-term value they can only achieve 2 years in the future and short-term stuff that they could actually measure. And this is a big problem for lots of organizations, because if we take the fact that people can just decide that anything is valuable, then everything is a good idea. And then it's very, very difficult to stop certain things that are not delivering outcomes. It's difficult to even know if 5 stories are enough or 50 stories are important. So Don Reinertsen writes about this problem, not this specific case study, but this problem more in general, in his phenomenal book of the Principles of Product Development Flow. I strongly recommend everybody reads this if you've not read it. It's a wonderful book that talks about lean product management. And Reinertsen in the book talks about how it's a very popular way of measuring value to say that an informed customer is the only person who can say, is this valuable or not? And that view is economically incorrect and dangerous. And the reason why it's economically incorrect and dangerous is exactly what happened to the BBC. Because the same people who are providing requirements were asked to say whether these requirements were fulfilled or not. So it's always going to be okay until you run out of money. There's people who provide requirements, if they're the ones who measure the success, they have an incentive to say that this was a good idea. And there's lots and lots and lots of reasons why even the best domain experts in the world can sometimes provide bad ideas. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. My previous talk at this conference goes into this in a lot more detail. So if you won't find the 2018 talk, and you'll see more details on that. But people make bad decisions. People make bad requests. And if the same people who make requests are the people who measure it, we're going to always have a problem. And that's the thing. So this is where another book that I've read over the last 2 years, I've not mentioned it last time, comes in. And I'm so angry at myself that I've not discovered this book sooner. It's an older book, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book that talks about how successful organizations deliver value very, very effectively. I strongly recommend you read the book if you've not read it. It's called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. In 4 Disciplines of Execution, Sean Covey and his friends talk about 4 key things that successful organizations do in order to deliver a lot of value that is different from how unsuccessful organizations work. And this is a wonderful book that's very easy to read. If you are up to date on modern product management practices, if you're up to date on lean product thinking and things like that, you're not going to discover anything revolutionary new in the book. But what I love about the book is it has wonderful terminology. They're incredibly good explaining these things. And they've nailed down the big difference between organizations that execute incredibly well and organizations that are not that good executing to 4 things. The first thing is they say organizations that are incredibly good executing focus on the really important stuff. Well, of course, bloody common sense. Focus on the really important stuff. Nobody's going to focus on the wrong things until you start looking at what most people in our industry do. And that example I gave of the BBC, they spent 75 million pounds several years without delivering any value because they were focusing on stuff they thought was important, but wasn't actually important. And when we talk about focusing on the wildly important, we also need to understand how do we know if something's really important or not. So the second big problem that potentially we have, and this is kind of what they talk about in the book, is nobody knows how to make a big difference between short-term value and long-term value. Everybody knows how to describe value that is supposed to happen at the end of this, 5 years from now, 2 years from now. And this problem of looking at how we go in the right direction is not just in software, it's everywhere. That's why they said the second most important discipline of execution is to act on leading measurements. Act on stuff that we can measure a week from now or 2 weeks from now that can help us drive value through seeing, are we going the right direction, and then kind of aborting if not, or changing the plan while we still have time to do it. Also, seeing if we've delivered something and then stopping it. So the third practice they talk about is keeping a compelling scoreboard. What they mean by that is once you have this leading measurement thing that you can act on, don't hide it. Don't keep it on one manager's desk in one PowerPoint somewhere. Publish it for people so they can make better decisions on their own. And they also talk about creating a cadence of accountability where relatively frequently, every week, every month, whatever frequently is for you, inspect these numbers and actually hold people accountable for kind of what they've decided, change the decisions if you want to change the decisions. So looking at kind of the story I gave you about the kind of a government office, they did exactly this. They focused on meeting this legislation at the point where they were supposed to meet it, and not on rewriting the system with microservices and Scala and who knows what. In order to do that, they found a leading measurement that they can look at every week or a few days after they release, which is humans, caseworkers processing more cases per day. And then they published that information, they tracked it, they let people make better decisions. And as a result of that, they were able to stop ideas that didn't work out. They were able to focus on things that really work and deliver 2 years earlier than expected. So this is where kind of impact mapping comes in. Impact mapping is a wonderful way of visualizing this whole thing. Visualizing deliverables through what in 4 disciplines of execution they would call leading indicators. Short-term value, impacts on our users, impacts on customers that we can measure after we deliver a story, and then focusing that on a big business goal, something that we want to drive to in months and months of work or kind of over a longer period. Impact maps are a visualization technique that was invented by a Swedish interaction design agency called Vilnius as a way of preventing the Swedish government from wasting horrible amounts of money on failed IT projects. And it's the fastest way I know to get stakeholders, developers, product people aligned on what we need to do and come up with a big picture visualization, help everybody focus their work. So looking at the 4 disciplines of execution, that's why I'm so sorry I've not kind of read that book earlier. They explain perfectly how to actually get value out of this. Because we have all this stuff we want to do, we need to focus the delivery there by focusing on the wildly important. But in order to do that, we need leading indicators of change, things that we can measure short term. And that's where kind of this whole idea of impact maps focusing on behavior change, a customer impact comes in. And that's kind of the research we're actually doing. How do people who succeed with impact maps do these things differently from people that just waste time? So here's a couple of things I think that people should remember about this. One of the most important things that is to get successful product development is to stop measuring whether we're shipping a solution and to start measuring whether we're solving a problem. These two things are not the same. For a lot of people, these two things are the same, but these two things are really not the same. We can ship a solution. I can release a mobile app, I can put some stories there, and that might be completely irrelevant because something else is preventing people from actually solving a problem. I can create a report for my end users that they potentially can use to manage the risk, but they might be prevented from managing the risk because the report is too late, or the report is in a format that they cannot consume easily, and things like that. So the best story about this, and I think I've mentioned this the last time, so I'm not going to spend too long talking about this, is the Sentinel case study from the FBI, the American Federal Bureau of Investigations. So they started rewriting the system, and after spending $360 million in rewriting it in an iterative way where they had the chance to kill it every month, they stopped it. And the big question was, why did they let it go for so long? Why couldn't they stop it sooner? Why did they have to spend so much money figuring out that it's not going okay? And the big conclusion in a paper called Why FBI Cannot Create a Case Management System is that they were measuring stuff like function points, story points that directly relate to complexity. And in effect, they were measuring whether they're shipping a solution. Every time they would deliver 20 story points or 50 story points, they wanted to deliver 40, so it's kind of okay. And this was their only measurement of progress. Are they going the right direction? They were not actually measuring if they've solved the problem for anybody. Now, this is where we get into the key idea from 4 disciplines of execution that can help us facilitate impact maps amazingly. In 4 disciplines of execution, they talk about basically 2 types of short-term value that is measuring whether we are solving a problem, not whether we're delivering a solution. The first type of short-term value they talk about is unblocking or completing a critical task for a user or a stakeholder. So if people are now not able to do something and our software will enable them to do it, unblocking that critical task is potentially good. That's relatively rare. Usually those things come as a result of external legislation or external control. A much, much more frequent one is this change in behavior. And that's the amazingly important thing. If you remember one thing from my talk, you forget everything else. Remember that behavior changes in users, in stakeholders, can be an incredibly good leading indicator of change. They can be an incredibly good way to capture impacts. And if you do impact maps, make sure that the stuff in the middle is behavior changes, because we can measure behavior changes on a shorter cycle. I can deliver something and I can see, are people clicking more? I can deliver another story and I can see, are people staying longer on the website? It doesn't have to be like perfect, but is it going in the right direction? And that's what's allowing us to kind of track these things. So when you're thinking about behavior changes, the critical thing to do is to say, you know, somebody will do something differently, because this differently piece is the really important. And talking to people who've been doing impact mapping for a long time and looking at different things, we constantly see patterns where people put stuff like customer wants or customer needs in the middle of an impact map. So something like, oh, when we release this story, our risk managers will be able to manage the risk, or they want to do this, or they need to. Customer needs, customer wants are an amazingly useful tool for UX research, for customer research, for UX testing. They're not good as short-term value. So they have their place in software projects, needs and wants. We definitely need to be able to understand user needs and wants to deliver a good product, but they're not good as a way of measuring short-term value, because anything can be a good idea. What we need to do to actually achieve value in short term is this kind of stuff. Phrase the middle of an impact map as somebody does something differently, or will start doing something they're not doing now, or should stop doing something they're doing we don't want them to do. The big key thing here is this thing is objectively measurable, this thing isn't. I can develop a piece of software and I can say, well, you know, these people will be able to monitor risk under perfect condition when it's not raining and everybody's in a good mood and they have a large screen and they have a good internet. By actually measuring whether they're doing it or not, I can look at whether they're solving a problem or not just delivering a solution. The other important thing when you facilitate impact maps that's interesting to consider is to look at where do we place what area. We've heard lots of stories of people who would have impact maps that say, oh, internally we're going to change our behavior like this, or developers will change the behavior to do these things, or operations people will change the behavior. And then the big question is that okay or not? So as another kind of relatively important facilitation tip, I would suggest that the deliverables should be in the zone of control and the impacts should be in the sphere of influence. There's a wonderful book about systems thinking called The Logical Thinking Process by William Detmer, where he talks about 3 types of systems. There are systems within your zone of control. If you decide to do something, more or less that will happen. So if I decide to build a mobile app, more or less that will happen. That's in my zone of control. Then there are the systems where there's a sphere of influence. If I decide that my users will stay longer on the website, I can try to influence that, but I can't guarantee it. Maybe they're not staying on the website because of some other stuff. Maybe kind of the internet connection is bad. Maybe the content is boring. And then there are things outside of our sphere of influence. So when we're doing an impact map, one of the key important things to do is stuff here should be inside of our zone of control. Stuff here should be in our sphere of influence. What I mean by that is, for example, putting developers should do something better, faster, easier is usually a deliverable. And this can work in interesting ways. For example, I worked with a bank where we were building some software to reduce the cost of transaction processing, reduce operational costs. That was the goal. Leading indicators of that were to make more transactions go automatically straight through, reduce the amount of transactions humans need to settle. So that was the key impact, have humans settle fewer transactions themselves. And we started looking at the reasons for this. And one of the reasons was that traders were leaving settlement notes. There was a free text field for traders to leave. If they type something in, the transaction cannot be settled automatically. A human has to look at it. And traders were leaving notes for accountants, but traders were also leaving notes for other traders there. And part of what we were changing is to allow traders to put priorities in notes and to mark up types of notes so that if there's an accounting note, a settlement person will open it. If there's a trading note, they will not. One of the people who was planning this with us was a stakeholder from the trading department. He said, but why do we need to build software for this? I can just tell the traders not to put trading notes in anymore. And then we were thinking about this. Well, I mean, I cannot as a developer, but you as a head of trading floor can do that. And that becomes a deliverable. Although it's nothing to do with software, it's within our zone of control. It's a deliverable. We don't have to build any software for it. We've just de-scoped 2 months of work. So things that are business changes that you can control are deliverables. Things that you can only influence are impacts. And please, please, please don't put stuff that is in your zone of control here. because then we don't have a measurement of value. If you put something that's inside your zone of control here, then you're measuring if you're delivering a solution, not whether that solution actually solves a problem or not. So another thing that we often heard from people is kind of trying to figure out what do they put here, what do they put in the goal? How do they balance out? How do they decide what goes where? Because should operators processing fewer trades go onto the goal level, or should there be an impact? You know, where do we put that stuff? And this is where I think a really good heuristic is to think about the difference between something that is useful and something that is successful. There's multiple levels of value. Some things can be useful to our users, but maybe not successful for us as an organization. Some things can be successful for us as an organization, but not really that useful for people. So, for example, we can increase the prices, or we can reduce the free tier, or things like that. And it's an interesting thing, kind of how do we balance out these things on a map? If you read kind of modern product management books, they kind of shy away from this often, because this is a tricky subject to talk about, because then in some cases we admit that what's good for the company might not necessarily be good for our users. And there's kind of an interesting case study that you can read about that in the Amazon way. Jeff Bezos famously said that the only prioritization technique that Amazon ever had was, out of all the possible options, focus on what's best for the customer. And that's nice to say because it's nice and lofty and people can do presentations about that, but it's not always true. Here's an example. In 2002, when Amazon was still kind of shipping mostly books, they wanted to optimize the website to disconnect it from the inventory system. So previously, the orders were only allowed if Amazon has enough books in the inventory. And what they wanted to do is they became so good with operations that if you order a book they don't have, they can still probably buy it and send it to you without you noticing anything. That's how good they became. So they came up with this idea that they wanted to allow people to order any amount of books. And what that meant is you can no longer have a drop down. It has to be a text field. You put in how many books you want. You don't need to go to the backend and check. So operationally, it's better. It scales better. Profit-wise, it's better because you can sell stuff you don't have. Worst case scenario, if they can't find the book, they will cancel the purchase and refund the money. But mostly they will. So, you know, the usability requirements for this text field validated numerically, order any amount of books. It went to development. Developers took it a bit too literally, like developers usually do. And they allowed people to order any amount of books, including negative books. Now, what happens when you type in -5 into the order form? Amazon says, oh, okay, so you've ordered -5 of this, the price is -$50, and you've ordered something else that costs $100, so the total price is $50. And people were able to kind of get the amazing discounts like this. There was actually a video from last year from McDonald's in Australia where they had the same problem. They were allowing people to customize their burgers, and somebody discovered that if you take everything away from the burger apart from the meat, the price is -10 Australian cents. And then you can order 50 of those burgers, and you've just saved some money on ordering something else. So when you think about this, is this useful for customers? Absolutely. They can get a better discount whenever they want. Is this successful for us as a business? Probably not. So we don't want stuff like that. So here's the thing. When we look at an impact map, this part here should really be what's useful to people. What are the behavior changes? What is useful for our customers? What is useful for our users? This part here, the business goal, should be about what does that make successful for us as an organization? This is value for us. This is value for other people. And that's a really, really good way of looking at the difference between what's an impact, what's a goal. The business goal is something we care about that makes it successful. An impact is a leading indicator of that value. It's usually behavior change. It's getting to do something kind of success, making this useful for people in some way. And ideally, we want both. We want to visualize these assumptions. One of the best things I like about impact maps is how they let us visualize assumptions. By putting something here and here, I say, I assume that by getting people to stay longer, we will grow mobile advertising. That's an assumption. We can measure it. And it's one of the best way of visualizing these assumptions that I know about. So another thing we've constantly heard from people is how when they kind of map out a large piece of work, the map becomes too big. And they end up kind of following the plan and it takes too long. So one of the suggestions I have is to think about not really planning a backlog, but to plan a tournament. We are going to get, once we have these leading indicators of change, features to compete against each other, to see which one is going to succeed. And an absolutely critical thing to do that is to make sure that when you're defining impacts, try to put a victory condition here. Don't just say stay longer. Say stay 5% longer. Say stay 10 minutes longer. Put a victory condition on it so you can measure it objectively. And then, okay, we have forums and chats. Let's do forums first. Are people staying 10 minutes longer? If yes, forums won, chats lost. We don't have to do chats because we have achieved what we wanted to achieve. And that's another wonderful thing about this visualization. We can organize a tournament of features and let them win or lose. We can see if we did forums and forums did not get people to stay longer, let's delete them from our software. Why are we paying for testing and maintenance in the future for this? Let's remove that stuff, it lost. And a really good idea to think about is try to organize a tournament of features. Also try to organize a tournament of impacts driving towards the goal. So from a facilitation perspective, if you're getting your stakeholders and your developers to kind of try and do too much here and to insist on a big backlog, one really curious trick we've heard from several organizations while interviewing them is do the first impact mapping session without any technical people in the room. Now, this sounds crazy, but let me explain why it's not. So it sounds crazy because without any technical people in the room, the business stakeholders might come up with something that's totally unimplementable. But the reason why it's a nice thing to do is you can use the excuse by saying, look, we don't have any technical people in the room. We can come up with something that's totally unimplementable. Let's focus on the value part first, and then we'll get the developers to come in later and come up with technical solutions. So that's an amazingly good way of disconnecting this. Instead of one session, you have 3 sessions. First session, business people only for this part. Second session, developers propose deliverables to match this. Third session, developers and stakeholders review this stuff together. It's a wonderful way to avoid solutionizing. It's a wonderful way to kind of organize a tournament of these things. So lastly, kind of the last really important tip that I have is we've heard from lots and lots of people that they try to do an impact map for the next 5 years of work and it's just too big. They wanted to do like a strategic transformation map that has everybody for everything and everywhere. And it's too big, it's too unwieldy, it's not the right format. So what I would suggest is kind of map a milestone of your product. When you do an impact map, put one milestone of what you want to do in the center, put the next most important value for the organization, the next most important successful thing there, and then map that out. Once you've delivered that, come back and do another map for something else. So doing maps like this, it's really important. You know, the map hierarchy can grow like crazy if there's too many things. Try to put one value at the start, or if you're doing a reverse engineering of a large backlog, we've heard this from several organizations that have done it, reverse engineer your backlog into 5 or 6 maps. And then what you do is you do Christmas prioritization. Christmas prioritization comes from a colleague of mine called Chris Matz, who had a huge influence on my work. Chris Matz talks about how you should never tell stakeholders to choose between must, should, could, because 99% will end up as a must. And instead of talking about yes or no, must, should, could, Chris talks about how we need to talk about yes and yes, but later. And this later might never come, it doesn't matter. But the question is, what is yes for now? So now or not now? And once you have 5 different maps, we can talk about, well, which map do you want to do first? We have an option of doing all 5 maps at the same time, but then we get all 5 business goals 2 years from now. Or we have an option of doing this map first, and we get this goal live in 2 months. And that's where the stakeholders really turn their lamps on. We start prioritizing goals. And the reason why this is called Christmas prioritization is I was doing a talk in Singapore a while ago, and between my bad broken English accent and their bad broken English accents, when I was talking about Christmas prioritization, one lady in the audience started asking, said, well, this Christmas prioritization, I don't understand it. Can you repeat it? And I said, well, it's not Christmas prioritization, but I love the name and I'll take it. And now when I introduce this to stakeholders, I say, look, you can open 5 presents at the end of this project. And that's okay. Or we can create a sequence of smaller Christmases, and you can open one of these presents next month, but only one. Which one would you choose? And that's how you do kind of this level of prioritization that becomes really, really impactful and amazing. So those are kind of 5 key tips for facilitating impact mapping. Hopefully, I've given you some interesting ideas to improve how you're doing planning. Again, you can download the slides from my website on this URL. And for more information about impact mapping, if you're interested, check out impactmapping.org. That's a website where we've collected lots of resources about impact maps for people on different levels of experience. Also, check out my website, Gojko.net. I write a lot about these things. Thank you very much. Hopefully you've enjoyed the session.
Yes, thank you very much for your sharing your experience, sharing your energy, and sharing confidence that all are possible, all things are possible. We are waiting questions. I will see, maybe do you have, can we talk about something? I don't see the questions, please.
So I guess, if we don't see the questions, we've already achieved what we need to achieve. So from a perspective of impact mapping, let's not delay people. Let's give them kind of a bit of time for coffee then. And that's kind of it. Go and visit impactmapping.org. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. But my reaction a little bit, when you explained so in such a good structure, it is easy to understand, easy to follow, easy to manage even. But sometimes it is very strange to find the borders between impact and how to say, and control. That should be their managers, agile managers should be very structured in this analysis, what that context and what is necessary for us, what is necessary for customers. It's not easy to split some values. We think that we understand the customer values, but when we asking directly, we can receive sometimes another answer.
Well, okay, that I said that's why this is not necessarily just a software problem. There are people dealing with this problem in other industries, and William Detmer wrote a wonderful book about systems thinking that kind of separates that out. I think one of the key things that I use as a heuristic there is to look at the question of risk. Like, even with the best of my efforts, how risky is that this thing will not happen? And if the risk is very low, then it's in your zone of control, then it's a deliverable. If the risk is, reasonable, then it's in your sphere of influence. If the risk is too high, then you're probably not even able to influence that. So it's outside of what you can theoretically do.
Yes, I agree. Because now it is so, we are so restricted in time, in short time period. We should do a lot of things. We should be ourselves in our life, very, very agile. and it should select what is important tomorrow, or what was important yesterday. And this is what risk management. Can you share your another box, what you are inspiring of way of thinking? You share something. You share some books.
Okay, I can write up all the books and I can paste it in the chat for the people in the session.
Okay, because it's very interesting.
Yes, I will do that. Also, it's maybe worth noting that we together with the Agile partner, who are kind of co-organized the sponsors of the workshop, we're running an impact mapping educational workshop for people in I think 2 weeks remotely. So if you're interested in learning more about impact mapping and figuring out how this could work in your domain, maybe join that session.
Okay. Thank you very much.